Hello there and welcome to the channel. This is Nerd World. If you're watching this in December as this went up, I hope you had a good Christmas and you're going to have a good New Year. This episode is part of my exploration of different fighters from the Star Trek franchise that actually seem to be not entirely useless. And in today's episode, which is only going to be a relatively quick one, we're looking at the Bomar patrol ship, which, it's still a fighter. It's 14 meters in length, it's tiny. It's a fighter craft. This ship was encountered by the USS Voyager in the Delta Quadrant. The Bomar were a moderately strong local race who seemed to patrol their borders with a single classification of vessel simply known as the Bomar Patrol Ship. What its actual classification and name was unknown, but there we have it, small vessel. As I said, it was 14 meters in long, roughly square in shape, with its engines at the rear, had a maximum warp capability of warp 8. It was a pretty nippy little ship for a vessel of its size. It was armed with directed energy weapons and torpedoes and had shielding, although it was a massively inferior ship individually against even just one of Voyager's shuttles, which was able to take on multiple of these craft with relative ease, not really feeling very threatened by them, although this was probably due to the technological disparity between Voyager and many of the races in the Delta Quadrant, including the Bomar. These vessels were not a significant threat to any Federation vessel in anything other than great numbers. They were able to demonstrate an ability to bombard a planet from orbit with relative ease, meaning their weapons actually had a pretty decent range, as well as an ability to penetrate planetary atmospheres with relatively little loss of kinetic energy or any other dispersal of the energy through the atmosphere. And again, do this from orbit, as they were able to bombard the wreckage of the SS Raven, a crashed civilian ship on the planet that had been kind of deposited there during an attack by the Borg, who for whatever reason hadn't bothered to finish assimilating it, which was always a question to me, as if that was the first time the Borg had ever met humans. Why didn't they finish assimilating the ship? Just because it had crashed? I mean, much of the technology was salvaged anyway. They didn't bother. It was there. They attack it, they wreck it. The Bomar would try to engage the USS Voyager as well, with over 80 of these small vessels, which were enough to drive off the USS Voyager, as it probably would have been able to sustain some damage from these small craft. Whether or not they'd actually been able to destroy it would be another question, but they might have stood a chance, maybe. But again, due to the technological differences, Voyager would have had every advantage, not least of which it was considerably faster than them, so it was easier to just run away. There was no need to get into an armed engagement. Voyager encountered these vessels while trying to pass through Bomar space on its journey home in the Delta Quadrant, but ultimately would have to fly around due to hostile relations now existing between the Federation and the Bomar. And there we pretty much have it. They were a single pilot craft. They didn't require anything else. The range was relatively limited, but they were designed to operate within the confines of Bomar space, operating moderately independently, but obviously operating from a planetary or orbital facility of some description, and possibly occasionally operating from larger carrier vessels, although these were never depicted. And I'm only hypothesizing that they probably existed. They were, as I said, 14 meters in length, warp 8 capable, but yeah. As I said, this is only a short video. I'm trying to explore how some fighters are not utterly worthless, but here's an example of one that realistically was probably fine when going up against contemporary races in their local region. Clearly the Bomar didn't feel a need to build larger numbers of any heavier cruisers to deal with their local defense, instead looking to these small craft, which was probably perfectly effective. It wasn't, seemingly, considering they had quite a lot of them and they were high speed, they were technologically sophisticated, there doesn't seem to be a resource reason or industrial reason why the Bomar couldn't build bigger ships. They simply chose not to, instead specializing in the production of large numbers of smaller craft, which for their defense and operational needs was perfectly adequate. Whereas many other fighters used by other states quite often are a complement to larger vessels or an accompaniment to them in some way, such as the McCall class carried aboard the Sovereign class starships. But these craft were clearly more like the Peregrine class or the Swarm fighters, designed to operate independently against the enemies of the Bomar, or potential enemies of the Bomar, as both a deterrent and weapon of war to be used against them. It's unlikely these ships had much in the way of power projection capability due to their small size. Their survivability and longevity in a sustained long-distance conflict would be questionable at best, but for keeping defense of your border, clearly they were adequate. As we see, other races in Eldragon also utilize fighters, such as the Talaxians and the Kazon, whose ships I'm not really going to cover, mostly because, again, like the Bomar ship, I think I'm pretty much making my own argument with the Bomar, that those ships were useful only when dealing with races of a similar level. The Kazon fighter, for example, was utterly useless against a Federation shuttle. But Kazon technology was hugely inferior, but they were okay against Talaxian fighters. Talaxian fighters were okay against larger Kazon ships, but only because of their similarity in technology, not because of any significant advantages the Talaxians had. So, again, fighters were shit in Star Trek, generally speaking. This is not an example of one of the worst, because clearly under the circumstances what they were needed for, they were perfectly adequate to be used as the mainstay ship. Another reason I'm not including Talaxian and Kazon ships is also they weren't the primary vessels utilised by the Talaxians as they did, or the Kazons. They had many larger, more impressive ships, which were more widely used, and again, those fighters were accompaniments and complementary ships to the larger vessels. There's only one more fighter which I know about or can think of from Star Trek that actually has decent ship-to-ship engagements, and is probably the most successful fighter type, which I'll be covering in my next video, basically rounding off this series. And if it has any decent popularity after December, as in December we always see a massive slump in viewer numbers, as mine have gone way down, and they weren't that high to begin with, so way down is pretty down for me. If I see a resurgence, I might also cover the really crappy fighters used by some of the other races. That's just, I can't understand why they build them in the first place, other than again for those extremely unique needs. I don't know yet I'm going to do that, might do, don't know. Either way, that's this fighter, the Bomar patrol ship. If you liked this video and you made it all the way to the end, please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, let me know what you think about the episode that these ships appeared in. It's the one where 7 of 9 basically went through a little mind mess up and she found out and remembered how she got assimilated and how they ended up in the Delta Quadrant and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, if you've made a lot of this in the video, thank you for watching, and bye bye.